Your friendly neighborhood natty here. My name is Matthew, and today's video I want to do a presentation on the 1860 Army, Colt's 1860 Army, particularly the Richards Mason Type 2. You've seen this firearm before in my SAO Revolvers Explained. Now, the reason I got this gun was because Suga of BTS, he actually had the black powder version of this gun in his Dejita video. His was the black powder version. Now, you'll hear me use terms like black powder, percussion, cap and ball, revolver. They're all basically talking about the same thing, which is it's this type of firearm back then. You know, things like the 1851 Navy, 1858 Remington, things like that that use black powder. So it actually doesn't use modern cartridges that we have today. Now, originally, I wasn't interested in getting black powder at all. At the time, it was something that I just didn't care for, although recently I have been in consideration for the 1858 Remington. I do kind of like how that one looks. That, and also I kind of like the looks of the Griswold and Gunnison, which is Colin Bohannon's gun in Hell on Wheels. So I may end up getting black powder, but at the time I didn't really care for it. I was just kind of thinking in my head, well, I love the way that this gun looks, but can I have this in a modern cartridge like 45 LC? And oddly enough, I wasn't the only one with that idea. So a long time ago, back in the American Civil War, which would have been fought from 1861 to 1865, you may see movies today or games where they'll be anachronistic, which means that the soldiers, the Union and Confederate soldiers, have guns that didn't exist in their time. I think I've seen one where they had it correct, like it looked like this, but it was a conversion like this, that it would fire self-contained cartridges, which wouldn't have been available at least until 1869 and past that. Yeah. That, or they'll just straight up use a Colt Peacemaker, which wasn't even available until at least 1873, which is fair. Black powder guns, they take a long time to reload. You literally have to put in the projectile itself, you have to put in the gunpowder itself, you have to set the primers itself. It takes a long time, and so the idea of reloading it, typically I feel like a Union and Confederate soldier would have just had two of them. So you don't have to bother going through, I mean, depending on how fast you are, maybe the 3 to 5 minute wait of trying to get the firearm reloaded. Now, that's not to say that there weren't any self-contained cartridge revolvers at all during the Civil War. There was two types. It was 22 short and 32 rimfire, and it was most likely a Union soldier that had those cartridge revolvers kind of as a backup gun. So naturally you might think, well, then why didn't they make a bigger caliber bullet for the self-contained cartridge, which I think would have been 44 caliber at the time. And the reason why is that nobody could make cartridge revolvers except for Smith & Wesson, and the 22 short and 32 rimfire, those were the two that were made by Smith & Wesson. The reason nobody could make it is because Smith had the Rollin White patent, which means that nobody could make a revolver that had bored-through cylinders, to hold self-contained cartridges. I think one company tried to get through it by boring the cylinders in the opposite direction. So you would load the gun instead of this way, they would load it this way, and that did get through the patent, but the idea wasn't really, it wasn't really popular enough to make a lot of money. And if you violated this patent, two things could happen. The first is that you'd have to pay a royalty to Smith & Wesson, and they have their trademark engraved on it. Or number two, you just get flat out sued. So as you can see, Smith & Wesson kind of had the stranglehold on bored-through revolvers in that time period, in the same way that Samuel Colt had kind of the stranglehold on the revolver design that we talked about in SAO Revolvers Explained. Kind of his his cap and stand system that he was inspired by working on a boat. He Samuel Colt patented that, and his company was doing really well because if you wanted to make something like that, you had to pay Colt lots of money. Except this time it was going to be Smith & Wesson. So after the end of the Civil War, there was quite a lot of clamoring, at least in the world of self-defense martial arts, that people wanted to move towards self-contained cartridges. But of course, we had the big problem that Smith & Wesson had the patent for bored-through cylinders to hold cartridges, and Rollin White did try to get an extension on that patent, just like Samuel Colt did before for his revolver. So it's nothing new, so to speak. However, this time, Fate decided that he would not get an extension. I think the Commerce, what is it? The Commerce Group or whatever, they actually denied his patent, so he couldn't get an extension. So Rollin White actually went to Congress, and Congress drafted a bill for him, an act for the relief of Rollin White, and it did pass both houses. In America, our legislative branch, our lawmaking system, we have two houses. We have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. And if a law is made, it has to pass both House of Representatives and the Senate, and then it goes to the president and it gets signed or it gets vetoed. Now here is an interesting turn of events. So after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and his vice president, I think Andrew Johnson, became president. But he was super unpopular. Nobody liked him, In fact, he's the first president to get impeached. I don't think he was in office for that long at all, until he was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he is a veteran of the Civil War. He fought for the Union, and he has no background in politics whatsoever. However, he really did not like Smith & Wesson. He was not a fan of them, and if I had to speculate, I think the reason why is because during the Civil War, as I said, nobody could make self-contained cartridges except Smith & Wesson. And Smith & Wesson did do it only in two tiny calibers, 22 short and 32 rim fire. Now they could have made a big bore revolver, 44 caliber, but I think the reason why...
Objection, hearsay.
Wait, you asked the question.
Oh.
Is because if war is extended, right? If war lasts a long time, longer than the 4 years in the Civil War was fought, then a lot of money can be made. It sounds terrible, I know, but all wars basically come down to money, okay? So Smith & Wesson is like, well, why do we want to make a big bore cartridge? That means that soldiers die faster, they don't recover, and then the war is fought shorter. We don't make a lot of money. So how about we don't make big bore caliber revolvers, just make the small ones, because if you get shot with the 22, 32, you can, as a soldier, you could get hit and recover from that and keep fighting. So the war is extended. That means more money is made. Not saying that's what it was, but it is pretty well known that President Grant did not like Smith & Wesson. So of course, twist of fate, even though Rollin White's patent did pass House and Senate, President Grant had to be the one to sign it in order to make it into law, and he actually didn't sign it. Now, I don't know. I know today either the president signs it or vetoes it, and if it's signed, it's a law. If it's vetoed, then it goes back to the House and the Senate, and I think it has to pass both houses majority vote to override the president's decision. But as far as I could find, it just said that President Grant didn't sign it. So maybe 150 years ago, they had the option of just not doing anything, not signing anything, and it's pretty much considered dead or vetoed. Now, with the death of the Rollin White patent, this meant that any manufacturer could now make revolvers with a bore-through cylinder to hold cartridges, such as we will see in, I think, 1860, Smith would release the number 3, I think it's called the Schofield number 3 top break in 45 Schofield. And then, of course, the famous gun that won the West, the 1873 Colt Peacemaker, which was very lucky for Colt because at the end of the Civil War, people wanted to move towards self-contained cartridges. And so Colt, not being allowed to make bore-through cylinders, they were going to have a very hard time surviving the market. All they had was their black powder guns, the 1851 Navy, 1860 Army. That's all they had. And after the Civil War, they were going to, what is it? Oh, after the Civil War, there were so many surplus, so many, leftover guns for black powder that there was nothing to do with. So it's really a stroke of luck silver lining that Rollin White's patent died, because as you'll see and as I talk about in this video, what Colt will do is that they will take a lot of their old black powder guns, all the surplus, and they'll actually convert it to hold modern self-contained cartridges, which certainly helped them help their business survive, escape the death throes, and then of course also market and release their 1873 single action army peacemaker. So now that it was safe to make self-contained cartridge revolvers without getting sued out of business, Colt went ahead and got to work on that right away. The first type of conversion would have been called a long cylinder conversion. So here what's happening is that Colt didn't really touch any of the black powder stuff like the loading lever, plunger, latch, things like that. Even though it would serve no purpose, they just left that alone, didn't really touch it. They also dovetailed a rear sight into the barrel. It also didn't have a loading gate. And then a firing pin was built on top of the hammer with a hole cut through the recoil shield so that the firing pin on the hammer could hit through, hit the primer, and then the gun would go off. That was kind of the easiest, simplest, and fastest way for Colt to convert some of their percussion revolvers into modern cartridge revolvers. Now the second type of Colt 1860 Army conversion is called the Richards conversion. So in 1871, a man named Charles Richards was awarded a patent to convert Colt percussion models into breech loading cartridge revolvers. And in his design, what he did was that he cut the back part of the cylinder to make room for a breech plate. And this breech plate had a floating firing pin, kind of like what we see today in modern revolvers. He had to grind down the firing pin on the hammer so that it was flat, so that it could, squarely hit the firing pin in the breech plate. I believe the breech plate also had a rear sight on it. It had a rear sight on the ring, the breech plate ring itself. A loading gate was added, and then the loading lever, plunger, latch, those things were removed, and what was put in was kind of your modern extractor assembly, kind of like on this Richards Mason Type 2. You see this, that extractor that was added as well on the Richards conversion. So that was kind of the Type 2 1860 Army conversion. It was pretty expensive to make though, especially with that extractor assembly. It was kind of a prototype at the time, so as you can imagine, those things can be quite costly when they're first designed and executed. Now the finalized type of the 1860 Army modern cartridge conversion is a Richards Mason Type 2, which is the one that I have here. A replica, of course, not a real one. Why would you fire a real one? But with this one, this finalized design, William Mason actually came about, added a couple more changes. And William Mason, oddly enough, he's actually the father of the Colt Peacemaker that would be released in 1873. And so for the changes here on the Richard Mason, what he did was that he removed the rear sight that was on the ring here, and he actually just cut a V-notch into the hammer. So you can see that there's kind of a V right there on the hammer, and basically that's what you would aim with. That's what you would line up with the front sight. And then the extractor assembly that I talked about before, that was expensive to make. I'm not 100% sure how he did it, but he basically made it a lot more simpler than what was done the first time, thereby reducing the cost to make the gun. And so that ended up being, of course, the Richards Mason Type 2. So when it came to getting the 1860 Army modern cartridge revolver, of course, I don't think you can get a long cylinder conversion, but you can certainly get a Type 1 or a Type 2. And so which one did I go with? As you can see, I went with the Type 2. Would I have still gone with that decision? I think so. I do like the Richards Mason Type 1. I like that there's a rear sight on the breech ring because, I mean, I feel like it'd be easier to see and to aim with that. But then the more I think about it, it's like, well, I grew up on the Peacemaker though, and the Peacemaker has the exact same kind of rear sight, at least on a traditional one. I know modern ones, they have an actual tunnel in the rear of the gun sight, but you know, I grew up with a Peacemaker, and so it's like I already know how to aim with that. This one is just a little difficult because it's it's 8 inches long barrel. So that's the only reason why. But even though I like the Type 1 design and looks, I think I probably would have just ended up with a Type 2 because it's so similar to a Peacemaker other than being awkward, long, heavy. And so I just feel like, well, I'm already proficient with the Peacemaker, so I might as well just stay with the design that's already within my skill set. All right, and that's going to be the end of the Colt 1860 Richards Mason Type 2 presentation. I hope you liked the history. I certainly did. I don't know if I call myself a history buff, but I just like knowing, I like learning how like people come up with this stuff. You know what I mean? Any martial art really, it's like, okay, we have this, how do we change it? How do we make it better? You know, kind of the innovation aspect of it, I thoroughly enjoyed. Next time we're going to talk about the Colt Peacemaker. Now I know we already talked about that in great detail in SAO Revolvers Explained, but I think we'll just talk about the brand of this one, which is the Ruger Single Six. It's actually the old model, not the new model. So that will be the video for next time, I think 2 weeks from now. Thank you guys for watching. If you liked what you saw today, please feel free to like. Oh, you can dislike too, that's fine. You know, any publicity is good publicity, right? Like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. You have a nice day, okay? Bye.
You learned martial arts! Martial arts, good!